Welcome back after lunch. I'm going to introduce our third session and our visiting speakers. Welcome to Northern Ireland. You've got the joy of a very sunny day, one of the very few that we get, so welcome. First of all, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rachel Kearns. She's a consultant anaesthetist at the Princess Royal Maternity Unit in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. She also holds a post of Honorary Associate Clinical Professor and is the course lead for the Bachelor of Medical Sciences Critical Care and Perioperative Medicine. She also holds the NHS Research Scotland Senior Research Fellowship and is the research lead for the RA UK. She has subspecialty interest in obstetrics and regional anaesthesia, which will be a great benefit to us all today. And her current research involves the linkage with routinely collected healthcare data and how we can use that. Welcome.
So I was told I got a prize if I worked out which button was which. So let's see if I get it. Right, thank you so much for asking me to come. I absolutely love coming to Belfast. It's fantastic to be here and on such a sunny day as well. It's such a lovely meeting just before I start. Honestly, it's absolutely delightful. So great to be here. So we're going to talk about epidurals, which we all know provide safe and effective analgesia, and which millions of women globally will have every year. Epidurals sometimes get a bit of a bad press, and women often, especially I think in this country particularly, we have a culture sometimes where we sometimes make women feel that they shouldn't need an epidural, or they should just be able to cope with labour pain like a boss, like this very impressive lady here. And sometimes I think women have to think quite hard about whether they should have analgesia for this really painful experience, which is quite interesting really. And when a woman's thinking about whether or not to have an epidural, she's sort of thinking about the risk to herself, but she's also got her baby to think about, and she'll be thinking potentially about risks and benefits to the baby. And it's sort of an interesting thing, I guess. So we sort of are brought up with the assumption, or there's often the assumption that natural labour is always going to be best for mother and baby. So before we start, we're just going to sort of challenge that a little bit and remind ourselves of why dealing with uncontrolled pain in this way can be quite helpful. So if you've got uncontrolled pain of any description, it doesn't have to be in labour, but if you break your arm or something bad happens to you, you're going to have a stress response. You're going to shoot up your cortisol levels. You're going to have a catecholamine surge. You're probably going to hyperventilate as well, because you're going to be pretty miserable. You're going to develop a respiratory alkalosis. If you keep hyperventilating, you'll shift your oxygen dissociation curve to the left. And if you have a fetus inside you, that's also going to affect the oxygen transfer to your fetus, which is probably not the best thing to happen. You may then, as the mother, develop a metabolic acidosis to compensate, which can again sort of impair fetal oxygen transfer, worsen fetal acidosis, and you can see how the baby may become distressed, and this can all result in adverse events that you don't want to happen. Also, in the longer term, uncontrolled pain is not great, can be associated with postnatal depression and PTSD. So there are many reasons why treating uncontrolled pain can be useful. So I think for all those reasons, natural labour is not always advantageous to mother and baby. Clearly, on many occasions, it can go absolutely fine, it won't have adverse events. But particularly in the more vulnerable women, the more vulnerable fetus, you can see how this could all play out detrimentally. So once the women sort of come to the decision, it may be quite a big decision for her to have an epidural, it's kind of beholden upon us to try and make sure the epidural works and optimise it and make things go as well as possible for her and her baby. So how can we optimise our epidural? How should we do this? Which techniques should we use? Should we puncture? Should we not puncture? Let's sort of have a look at the evidence for that. So we'll just start off by comparing the two sort of main techniques that we had up until pretty recently with epidural and CSE. And this is an older meta-analysis, but it still kind of stands. They compared epidural and CSE with the primary endpoint, sort of interestingly, of time to analgesia. So they were looking at rapid onset of analgesia. Now, if they did lots of comparisons, but we'll just focus in on the low-dose epidural group because that's the group that are kind of relevant to our modern day practice. And what they found, they sort of summarised the results here, but what they found was that rapid analgesia was better with the CSE group, but you can see there weren't really any other particular advantages or disadvantages if you want to look at it another way, but itch was more common with CSE, and it sort of led them to conclude that CSE was associated with faster onset analgesia, so might be useful in women with severe sacral pain or in whom they were really struggling, maybe had a failed epidural or OP position and were just sort of needing that rapid onset. But otherwise, no massive reason to suggest that we should be doing it in everyone. Obviously, there are situations where it might be useful. In terms of mode of delivery, it didn't really seem to make much of a difference. So while CSE is associated with some fetal heart rate traces, it doesn't seem to increase the risk of operative delivery. So what about the more sort of recent notion of dural puncture epidural? Now, this isn't something we do in our unit. I'm not sure if anyone around here does dural puncture epidural, but it's something that's been talked about quite a lot. So in this, rather than doing a CSE, you obviously make a little puncture in the dura with a spinal needle, then do your epidural as usual, and the sort of rationale is that some of the drug may infuse over it, may just make your block onset a bit more rapid, a bit more less likely to fail. So there has been a real interest in this. So there have been 3 systematic reviews, and so far they haven't really found any clear evidence of benefit. But what they have gleaned is that using a slightly bigger spinal needle is probably better. I guess you make a bigger hole, so you're going to get more spread. And using programmed intermittent epidural boluses, as we've heard earlier, might be optimal for epidurals as well. I think it probably is. Seem to be the optimal way to do this. But as was sort of pithily said in a very recent editorial in Anesthesiology, dural puncture epidural appears to be a clever idea in search of an indication. So has it found its indication yet? So we can look and see, there was a meta-analysis last year. There's been a few of these sort of reviews. This is the most recent one. It basically assimilates all the data to date. So there's 10 RCTs, over 1,000 patients, comparing epidurals with dural puncture epidural, again with this primary endpoint of rapid onset analgesia. Maybe that is the most important thing to women, I'm not sure. But anyway, what they showed was that yes, it did result in faster onset of analgesia, but otherwise there weren't really any advantages, particularly neither were there any major disadvantages. So you can see PDPH, you might be thinking, oh, maybe there's a higher risk. There didn't seem to be, but there's big confidence intervals and maybe there aren't enough numbers in terms of the data yet. So I think we'll probably hear more about this. But they concluded, probably rightly, I think, that yes, faster onset of analgesia, it may have a place in certain patient groups, potentially, but no other real advantages to recommend it. But people are still keen to look for an indication. So what about obese patients? Obviously more difficult to perform epidurals in, harder to feel your landmarks, harder to know if you're in the midline, and perhaps DPE's got a place here because you obviously guarantee your midline, and maybe this might decrease the failure rate in this group of patients who we know have a higher failure rate for epidurals. So a group of people in America looked at this just a year or so ago, did a double-blind RCT this time of obese parturients and tried to really optimise their technique by following the literature using a bigger spinal needle and the programmed intermittent epidural bolus technique with PCEA. So they were really trying to optimise their chances of making this work really well. So they compared epidurals and DPE group, and they had a composite outcome of just basically things that can go wrong with an epidural. So better on one side than the other, needing lots of top-ups, catheter needing to be pulled back or replaced or whatever, or failed conversion to anaesthesia. And what you can see pretty quickly from looking at this is it didn't really seem to make much of a difference to their primary outcome, neither to any of the component parts when they pulled it all apart. And they concluded again that there wasn't really any advantages, even in this sort of higher risk patient group where they thought there might be. So I think it's still looking for its indication, sadly, for DPE. So that's a shame. So when we're thinking about epidurals, we thought about what kind of technique we should use, what needles we should use. We can think about what dose of drugs we should use. I think we all probably in the room are using low-dose epidurals. I doubt anyone's putting 0.5% bupivacaine down and walking away for the rest of the shift, delighted with themselves. So most of us are probably using about 0.1% bupivacaine, I would imagine, around here. It's certainly what we're using. But when you read the literature, you sometimes see that people seem to go even lower than that, and I've always wondered whether that just meant women were sorer. Was there any advantage? Like, were they less likely to have an operative delivery, or were they just sore and a bit miserable? So who knows? So our group did a meta-analysis. This is Lucy, my PhD student at the moment. She's done a meta-analysis of 32 studies looking at women with epidural in labour. So they compared high dose, which probably not many of us do, so we define that as greater than 0.1%, low dose, which is anywhere between 0.08 and 0.1%, and ultra low. So we were looking at this group where, I have to admit, we don't do this at the moment, but less than 0.08%. And our primary endpoint was mode of delivery. Now, we did the comparison in all different directions. I can tell you straight off that the high concentration group were no better. None of the outcomes are better, and it's a bit old-fashioned, so we won't look at them. We'll just look at the ultra-low versus low concentration. There were 5 studies there. So again, I've sort of tried to just smoosh all the outcomes together so you can see. So these are sort of dichotomous outcomes, and you can see that there was no real difference in terms of mode of delivery or any of these outcomes, nausea and vomiting, motor score, although you can see the Bromage score looked like it was going to favour ultra-low. For the continuous outcomes, you can see the only one that really reached significance was reduction in total local dose, which is not exactly rocket science or surprising. But we did some fancier stats, we did some Bayesian stats on this, and actually when you did it that way, there was an increased chance of having an SVD by about 66% and a reduced chance of having a cesarean by about 88%. Now that doesn't reach statistical significance in the traditional sense of the word, but it's information. When you do stats and it's like p less than 0.05 or not, you sort of miss a lot of information. So potentially ultra-low seemed to have to be as good, essentially, as low-dose local anaesthetic. It didn't seem to have any disadvantages, and it may have some advantages, especially to do with the reduction in local anaesthetic dose, which, as I'll come on to later, why that might also be useful. So what about, so pain relief is a bit of a given. We know that epidurals work really well for pain relief, and that's kind of what we do, day in, day out. But might there be other advantages? Now, at the start, we were talking about the change in the physiological response, and you can see how you can sort of get to thinking it's not too much of a leap to think that that might be beneficial in particular patient groups, including some of the women that we heard about earlier from our cardiology colleagues. And severe maternal morbidity is a sort of concept I think we're going to hear a lot more about over the next couple of years. And what that refers to is a really sort of serious event that happens during pregnancy, around the time of childbirth, or postnatally to a woman. And it's pretty serious stuff, so heart attack, stroke, PE, sepsis, or a serious procedure like hysterectomy or tracheostomy. So it's pretty major stuff. And obviously this is a sort of global threat to maternal and child well-being, and whether epidurals can provide some sort of protection towards this has become a bit of a topic of interest. So before we start, let's sort of look at how common that might be in the UK to start with. So this is a Scottish study of over 750,000 births over a recent time period, looking at severe maternal morbidity from conception all the way through to 6 weeks postnatal. And they looked at women who had a severe maternal morbidity event compared to those who did not, and looked at incidence and associations. And what they found was that this happened in about 10 per 1,000 women. Some women will have had more than one event, but they just looked, did you have one or not, essentially. And it was associated with a greater than 2,000 risk of mortality. So mortality is quite a difficult thing to study because it's so rare, but severe maternal morbidity is much more common and gives us a chance to really sort of look at what's happening with these women and why it might be happening. And when they looked at the associations and essentially the risk factors, again, not that surprisingly, older age, higher BMI, having a multiple birth, previous cesarean, being comorbid, and having diabetes, even gestational diabetes, was fairly strongly associated with having a severe maternal morbidity event. So not totally shocking, but when you look at that list, many of those features will crop up in your list of people in whom you might think, it would be a good idea to do an epidural in that woman. So it's sort of interesting to think about. And I don't think severe maternal morbidity is going to go away anytime soon. This is data from NAP7. This is the activity report. It's literally just out. And when you look at their BMI results, you can see just in the last not even 10 years, it's jumped by over 2 points. And it's now become normal to be overweight. We actually did something really, really similar to this in our unit. It's a poster at the OA, and we got very similar results. BMI is just sort of skyrocketing. So I really don't think that severe maternal morbidity is going to reduce anytime soon. So might an epidural be helpful? Well, a group from New York State, you'll have heard this name before, Guglielmo Minotti and colleagues, they publish a lot on big data studies, and this is a New York-based, US population-based data study of over 500,000 vaginal births, so just vaginal births. They didn't look at sections or any other operative births, and they compared epidurals, women who'd had an epidural with women who did not, for the primary endpoint of severe maternal morbidity at the time of birth. So what did they find? Well, they found that there was an association between having an epidural and a reduction in severe maternal morbidity in all women. They saw it across strata of different ethnic groups. They saw it in low-risk women to some extent, although it didn't seem to make such a difference. But in high-risk women, as defined by having a comorbidity, they seem to find quite a strong protective association. So kind of interesting. However, as I say, a bit limited by the fact they only looked at vaginal birth. They only looked around the time of birth as well. They didn't look at the postnatal period, where quite a lot of morbidity occurs, as we know. This is something our group's looking at, and I've almost got the results ready to submit, so hopefully be able to share them soon. But I think it's a really sort of interesting concept. This group went a wee bit further as well, so they were interested in whether, how this happened and why it should happen. And they sort of hypothesised that it was mediated via postpartum hemorrhage, and that actually having an epidural in would make it easier to manage PPH, because firstly you'd have a cannula in, secondly an anaesthetist would know of your existence, would be sort of looking after you. Or definitely looking after you, sorry. Thirdly, that, it's easier to do something to you to make the bleeding stop because you're more comfortable in the room potentially, compression or a pack put up or whatever. And if you needed to go to theatre, it could be done more quickly. And hopefully, if the epidural is working well, avoid the need for a quick spinal or a GA done in a bit more of a sort of wham-bam fashion. So it sort of makes it plausible. And what they found was that about 20%, so about a fifth of the association was explained via the management of PPH, but it didn't tell the whole story basically. There's still 4/5 of that story that we don't really know the answer to. So I think sort of watch this space. I think there'll be more about this, but I think it is interesting and sort of gives a bit of evidence to the dogma, I guess, that we're all brought up with, that these high-risk women should have an epidural, but when you actually search for the literature for that, there actually isn't that much, surprisingly enough, as I discovered. So we've sort of talked about the advantages. Pain relief, yes, obviously, potentially helpful to reduce severe maternal morbidity. Early days of that, and we'll see, but plausible. So are there disadvantages? So we'll talk about the hot topic of the day, which is maternal fever. There's a lot of chat about this at the moment, and there's a lot we don't know about it. So what we do know is that epidural seems to be causally linked with intrapartum fever, with an odds ratio of between about 3 and 14, so pretty strongly linked, and people seem quite comfortable with saying they feel it's causally linked, not just associated. It seems to be specific to labour, so if you have an epidural and have a section, it doesn't seem to happen. If you are not pregnant and you have an epidural, it doesn't seem to happen. Don't really know why. And we know that intrapartum fever, sadly, is associated with neonatal brain injury. But what we don't know is why the fever happens. Is it a sort of immunomodulatory thing? Is it a thermoregulatory thing? Is it infection? We don't think it is infection. That's the one thing we probably don't think it is. But it does usually result in people giving antibiotics to both women and probably the baby as well if they have a fever. And we don't know if different neuraxial regimes make any difference. We don't know if you can do anything about it to stop it from happening in the first place. And most importantly, in my opinion anyway, we don't know if having an epidural-related fever in and of itself is related to poor neonatal neurological outcome. So fairly big questions. So if we sort of we obviously can't talk about all of this, that would be a whole talk in itself, but this group looked at whether there was anything you could do to stop it. So it's a meta-analysis really recently, just last year in the BJA, looking at women with fever in labour, whether they had an epidural or a different form of analgesia, and whether they had a fever, and whether there was sort of neonatal complications or adverse events. And what they found was that not having an epidural at all, so here's one for Remy, you weren't going to get an epidural-related maternal fever, unsurprisingly, and the reviewers did argue with them that maybe they shouldn't have included Remy when they were looking at epidural-related maternal fever. But you can avoid having an epidural-related maternal fever by having a different form of analgesia, so that's kind of useful, I guess, to know, so that's good. But if we sort of take Remy out of it and assume that the woman had to have an epidural for whatever reason or really couldn't manage without one, then what they found was that intermittent boluses were probably potentially advantageous and protective and seemed to reduce the risk of it happening. Whether that was a dose-related thing, I'm not sure. The dose-related thing was a bit mixed. They did one analysis which showed it was protective, then they excluded some studies they felt were poor, and then they didn't show a difference, so not sure. But intermittent boluses definitely seem to do something. And high-dose steroids did, although probably none of us are going to be jumping up and down desperate to give methylpred to all these women. But paracetamol didn't do anything. And what they really didn't have was any data on the neonate. So real dearth of data there. So we still don't know the answer to that question, but I'm sure more information will come out fairly soon. So we're sort of on the subject of the baby now and neonatal outcomes. So important to the mum, obviously. Am I going to be okay? But is my baby going to be okay? Am I going to do my baby any harm by having an epidural? And some information to reassure us, hopefully. So whilst the epidural is quite good at blunting the maternal stress response, the good news is it doesn't blunt the fetal stress response. The baby comes out all guns blazing generally and doesn't have a blunted stress response, which is good because the baby needs that to survive after birth. So that's cool. But if you compare epidural with sort of IM opioids or systemic opioids, this isn't REMI, this is sort of your bog standard midwifery-led intramuscular opioids, and we look at sort of neonatal outcomes, we can see that actually they're no worse with an epidural. If anything, they're slightly better. But if you do have an epidural, you're less likely to require your baby to require naloxone, which is quite important to women. You don't want your baby getting carted off to be resuscitated. Now, I hasten to add, this is not remifentanil, this is traditional systemic opioids. So no difference in neonatal outcomes. If you think opioids are important, you're kind of worried, oh God, what if I put opioids in my epidural? Is that going to be bad for the baby? You can also be reassured. This was a meta-analysis of putting your actual opioid in compared to not, and it didn't show any difference in APGAR scores, so that's good. And if you think, I want to do a CSE, is that going to be bad because I know that fetal heart rate traces can be affected, and is that going to be a problem for the outcomes? Well, it turns out from a meta-analysis, again, so lots and lots of data, that it doesn't look like it does. So that's kind of reassuring and kind of useful to know, and maybe does indicate that hopefully epidurals aren't causing harm by causing fevers. But I think we need more data to say that for sure. But this data, I think, is reassuring. Then obviously kids grow up and every parent wants their child to meet their milestones, and the interesting thing about the papers that I sort of ran through there very briefly is that none of them really talk about the baby when it's a bit older. They only talk about the baby after birth, where it's easy to collect the data, you can get APGAR scores, you can get resuscitation data, but what happens when they grow up? So will an epidural affect the baby in the longer term? So you get extra points if you can get all the cultural references. So those of us of a certain age will recognise all of this, probably, hopefully most of you will. But there are very, very few data on childhood outcomes. There's one really good study which sounds ancient and really weird, but it's actually really impressive. So it's 4,500 births in the US back in the day, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when all this was going on, and compared epidural versus no epidural, but followed them up for almost 20 years, which I think is absolutely amazing, and showed no difference in learning disabilities at the age of 19. So up until pretty recently, there wasn't much more than this. This was like the big study. This is something we wanted to look at in our population data set. So we looked at this in Scotland, around about 400,000 live births, about a fifth of whom had epidural. So epidural was definitely not the norm for us. And we compared women with an epidural with women who didn't have an epidural with the neonatal outcomes. So I'm not going to focus in on this slide. I know it's small, but essentially there wasn't any difference in the neonatal outcomes. So that was reassuring. If anything, the epidural was slightly protective. But what was much more interesting was we were able to look at longer term outcomes, which is a much harder thing to do. But we had health visitor assessments at age 2 to 3 when the kids are sort of reaching their sort of fairly seminal milestones. That's quite a big deal. I remember going to that with my little girl who pretended she couldn't speak. She just kept saying, "Mama, Mama." I was like, oh my God. So that was awful, but it is quite a big deal. So a parent, you go to the tree and you want them to pile up the bricks and you want them to do the puzzle properly. And unlike my child, kids who'd had the epidural, the mums who'd had the epidural were fine. So there wasn't any difference in adverse development as scored by health visitors in a kind of standardised way in social skills, gross motor, fine motor skills, communication skills. So again, reassuring, and if anything, the epidural group where it was protective. We can't really talk about epidurals and the sort of child growing up, unfortunately, without talking about autism. This has been in the press recently. You've probably all heard about it. There was a study done a few years ago, not that long ago, a couple of years ago, in a Californian cohort, which showed an association between epidural use in labour and autism in the offspring, and it did cause a bit of upset. So they reported a 37% relative increase in risk, and it hit the press and everyone was very worried it was going to cause undue alarm. All the Royal Societies and National Societies, SOAP, OA, College, everybody came out and said, this study's flawed, serious methodological flaws with it. We're really concerned about its validity. But anyway, the information was out regardless of that. So it's useful to start. It's quite interesting to think what's happened since its time. So as with all science, somebody's come out, and it wasn't quite, Wakefield-esque complete nonsense. They've done a proper study and they've reported it reasonably responsibly. It's just obviously when the media gets hold of it, it becomes very one-sided. So this group had done the study. It was published in JAMA Peds, so a big sort of high impact journal. But as always happens with science, other authors came out to see if they could confirm or refute. So I won't go through all of these individually because they're all pretty similar. They're all retrospective birth cohorts involving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients. So they're all massive. They all look at labour epidural compared with not having a labour epidural. And the results are here. So basically, in a nutshell, they either didn't show an association, or if they showed a very weak association, when they did a sort of thing called sibling matching, where you just take siblings from the same mother, and one pregnancy she had an epidural and another pregnancy didn't, and compared them, there was no difference. And what that does is control for all the other things that you don't have in a data set, like your parenting, your education, what you eat, whether you're passive smoking, all of these lifestyle, environmental factors that you can't really account for in a data set. So when they did sibling matching, they didn't see any difference. And there's been another 2 studies more recently. The one by Hegvig et al.'s got about 4 million people in it, and they didn't find any difference. So I think hopefully that issue sort of put to bed, but who knows? I think we may see other studies coming through about that. So just to conclude, I think that's my time pretty much up. So CSE and dural puncture epidural might have a place if rapid analgesia is required, or if you've got someone who's particularly struggling with sacral pain, or you maybe had a failed epidural and you want to have a sort of higher chance of quick success. But there's little to recommend dural puncture epidural as being beneficial over a standard epidural at present. Ultra-low local may have some advantages. I don't have experience of that yet. We haven't made the jump, but it's kind of interesting to think about whether we could or should. Severe maternal morbidity, I think, is something we're going to hear a bit more about. It's highly associated with mortality, as you might expect. And epidural there might be evidence that does reduce severe maternal morbidity, which is interesting in these sort of high-risk patient women. Perhaps we should be recommending epidurals more strongly in those groups. Epidural-related maternal fever does remain poorly understood. There's lots of work going on trying to understand it a bit more. Intermittent dosing might reduce the risk, which would be great, but we still don't know what the implications are for the baby, and I think that's a fundamental sort of $64,000 question. That doesn't sound very much in these terms of money, but anyway, you know what I mean. An epidural does not seem to adversely affect neonatal outcomes or childhood development in the data we have, which is hopefully reassuring to some extent, and there is no clear causal relationship between epidural and autism, and I think you can use that information to reassure your patients should they ask. So that's me. I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you. We'll do the questions at the end, but please send them in through Slido. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mark Stacey. He's an obstetric anaesthetist with extensive clinical and teaching experience. He has an interest in the difficult airway and the human factors around this and how to improve our teaching of the can't intubate, can't ventilate scenario. He's involved with research with elite athletes, the military and business, and looking into the human factors. He's also developed a system with colleagues to enhance the skills, understand the cognitive workload to maximise performance, and has an interest in improving well-being as well, especially in the stressful situations that we find ourselves in, and runs a workshop online called Medtrim, which is available to you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's absolutely fantastic in Belfast. The weather, of course, is always like this when I come. Just go back in. I gave a talk at the OAA on human factors in obstetrics, and I'm going to give you a slightly different version of it, which will hopefully be even better than the one those of you who came to the OAA meeting was. I have a particular interest in performance, particularly performance under pressure. And I'm going to try and get you to perform under pressure today because I suspect you've been sitting there post-lunch thinking, can he shut up so I can go back to sleep? I am an obstetric anaesthetist, and with my interest in obstetric anaesthesia and managing difficult airways, it does get you in the zone, hopefully, for trying to perform in a high-risk environment in an appropriately and safe manner. Now, as was mentioned in that brief, I always listen to those things and I think, who the hell are they talking about? I have been quite involved with DAS over the years in terms of improving some of the teaching materials available, including the can't intubate, can't ventilate scenario. And up until Wednesday, I have never, ever been involved in one. And I was doing an ENT list I don't normally do. You can see where this is going, can't you? And I will tell you the full story over beers after the session, because I'm still trying to compose how fortunately I didn't have to do a surgical area, but it's the closest I've come. And for those of you who have been involved in a situation like that, I share your pain. For those of you who haven't, try not to go there, because it was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. And I spent about half an hour chatting to one of my airway mates yesterday about having a debrief on the topic. It's quite scary, even when you've done anaesthetics for a very, very long time. So, we won't be talking about that this afternoon. As was mentioned, I have an interest in well-being, and I've been lucky enough over the last 10 years to work with a couple of individuals. Steve is ex-Special Forces, so if any of you think he's upsetting me, he may actually be in the room. And Andy, who is the guy not in red on the right, is a professor of performance. If you ever get a chance to hear him speak, he's an absolute genius. And together we've been developing a variety of different courses that enable performance in high pressure environments. I'm not going to talk about much about that today, though. One of the reasons we set it up is because we believe in that statement at the bottom, that as clinicians I will attend to my own health, well-being and abilities in order to provide care of the highest standard. We cannot look after the patients we look after unless we look after ourselves. And I have to say, it is absolutely wonderful to be in an environment like this, with a nice lunch and nice company and some quite sort of animated conversations about the stuff that we do. That's been really good. Anybody know what this tree is? I usually come across a fairly well-travelled bunch. The baobab, yes. Do you know the story of the baobab? I don't know who said that, sorry. Huh? Okay, so what the Africans say about the baobab is that God was so unimpressed with his bloated arrogance that he planted it upside down. And that's why it looks like that. So this picture's on my Twitter feed, whatever that is. And it's to remind me on a daily basis that arrogance in our jobs is a pretty dangerous thing to have. It's also to remind me actually arrogance in lives is a pretty dangerous thing to have. So on that point, I think 90% of what I'm telling you I think is correct. I just can't tell you which 90%. I think it's really, really important. If you think I'm saying utter tosh, or if there's something I don't explain very well, I really would like you to challenge me in the latter part of this session. I was also part of a very inspirational and brainy group over the last 5 years looking at developing and delivering some human factors guidelines. And I'll give you a link to this later on, because if you're going to come on days like this, I think it's quite useful if you actually implement some of the learning you've had. And we spent 5 years writing 2 papers. Incredible group chaired by the amazing Fiona Kelly, who's at the bottom in the middle there, and a very rubbish picture of her actually. But I think there are 7 professors. It ranges from human factors to engineering to human performance to clinicians who have an obsession with human factors. And what we're trying to do is to make it easy to do the right thing and make it virtually impossible to do the wrong thing. So these are kind of things I'm going to cover over the next half an hour: human vulnerability, a bit about human factors, which I'm hoping you know a little bit about. I'll introduce you to something that I call the simplest model of the mind, which I use for a variety of reasons, primarily for things like teaching, but certainly understanding performance. A few strategies to maximize us, and then, if I've got time, I'll just show you one slide with a human factor paper that you can take away and read at your leisure. So, you're all obstetric anaesthetists, am I correct? Okay, it's your patient. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. She's a 30-year-old grand multip. For the midwife who's looking after the patient, it's her 4th night of nights. You are the clinical team. It's your 3rd night on nights. There's 40 units of syntocinon and 500 ml of Hartmann's drawn up, ready for a significant potential PPH. The intravenous infusion is changed. I was told, sorry, not to go over there. I'll try not to do that again. So you can see the holes lining up, can't you? And I could go on. I mean, I could tell you the rest of the story, but you can probably predict what happens. It's not a good outcome. So let's see how good you are at performing under pressure. So what I'd like you all to do is to hold your breath, take a nice deep breath in, and you can put your hand up when you spot the mistake. Everybody ready? Sorry, let's go back again. So I hope you can all hold your breath. Keep it high. Embarrass your colleagues. You can breathe now if you've spotted it. Okay, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5 at the back. It's funny, it's always the people at the back who spot it. Okay, this is really embarrassing, chaps. I'm glad to see Damien got it this time because he didn't get it last time. Okay, those of you who haven't spotted the mistake, shame on you. That's why I took all the words out of my slides. Okay, so you can't read. Can you count? So what we're going to do is a counting thing. So together you're going to shout out loud. This is an addition. Okay, so the first number is, I think the second one is 40. So what's 1,000 plus 40? Okay, so you're ready. Okay, let's go. Can't hear you. Louder. Okay, stop. Who said 5,000? Hands up, those who said 5,000. Okay. Go on, hands up. I heard a lot more 5,000s than that. Okay, did anybody give us a different answer? 4,100. Okay, is that the correct answer? Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah. The slightly worrying thing is, of course, if you say 4,100, there's quite a lot of evidence that you're actually a psychopath. I'm not saying you are. My colleague did this. He did this particular test in a group of 300 accountants, and they all shouted 5,000 very confidently, which is probably why the world is in such a mess. Okay, so you can't read and you can't count, so let's move on. When I run workshops on this topic, I often ask people what they think of human factors, and I just want you to reflect. I don't want you to answer it, but I just want you to reflect on that. But usually it's something along these kind of lines. This man's obviously an expert.
Yeah.
I don't know why people laugh when that happens, but it's interesting. He's obviously an expert, and yet he made a mistake. Now, do you think there is any point in saying to this gentleman, you need to learn how to ride a bike better? Yeah? Happens in health. Or, I'm going to punish you for making a mistake. Yeah? In health, certainly, and I've been a clinician quite a long time, I think there's been the wrong emphasis on the way that we manage these particular incidents. Human beings are vulnerable. And I'm going to show you, I've already demonstrated some of the vulnerability, and it will get worse. Don't worry. So, for many years, we talked about human factors looking at things that go wrong. But actually, there's lots of things that go right now, and we're beginning to realize actually there are two sides to this. The scales, we need to spend a lot more time looking at the really good things we go. And I have to say, the presentations this morning I thought were fantastic. Trainees, incredible work you've been doing, particularly in the difficulties that we've had over the last 3 years. But really impressed sitting there listening to them and being far more articulate, I suspect, than I am this afternoon. But we do tend to spend and focus a lot of our time and effort on things that go wrong, and I think it is important that we do that. But we mustn't forget that we do lots of things that go right. And if you go on to human factors, if you're looking for a human factors definition, you'll find something like that. In a work context, blah, blah, blah. It's pretty boring, isn't it? But as I said, what we're trying to do is to make it easy for you to do things right and difficult to do things wrong. And what I'm talking about, hopefully, are things that are skills. How do you get good at a skill? Yep, definitely gone deaf. Practice. Lots of practice. Because what you're trying to do with that skill is to take that skill, having learned and practiced it properly, turn it into a habit, and turn it into a part of your behaviour. And that's what you need to try and do when you're teaching this to people. So whenever I do teaching on any subject, actually, whatever I'm talking on, I always try and embed a little bit of human factors or human performance psychology in that as well. And if you go on a human factors course, these are the kind of things you might cover. I'm not really going to cover those. I'm going to cover things slightly differently. This is called an error troika. It's work taken from NASA, which a lot of the human factor science comes from. And what they talk about in NASA is if you want to design a problem so that it doesn't become a problem, you need to make sure that this bottom bit of the pyramid, this avoid error bit, is really nice and sound. If you can't avoid the error, you need to trap it. Unfortunately, the smallest bit of the pyramid is the bit at the top. That's the bit that mitigates the consequences of the error. That's you or me. In health, if there's an error in health, which bit do they concentrate on? Not these two. Okay? And as we already know, three key issues about human performance. Error is normal. Performance is variable. I have quite an old and poorly cat now who has to take a regular tablet of an ACE inhibitor. And I've been on antibiotics last week, and I put my antibiotics next to the ACE inhibitor. You can see where this is going, can't you? And yeah, I managed to give my 2-kilo cat a large dose of antibiotics for a 90-kilo man. But the way that we can mitigate some of these issues around error is by improving communication and certainly working better as teams. So, principle number 1. Human beings are fallible. And what you're trying to do is design out the chance of that error occurring and design in barriers that prevent that error progressing to harm. It's successfully used in other safety-critical industries, but not so much in health. Underlying principle number 2. Healthcare currently relies on high levels of human performance. And it does. And we are high performers. But we're not perfect. So let me introduce you to one of my favourite models. So this is a model, it's called the simplest model of mind. It's based on understanding of the working memory. Would anybody like to give me a definition of working memory? It was very nerve-wracking. Sorry? Absolutely right. So it's the memory you're using at this precise moment in time. And it's limited. The psychologists, I think it's a brilliant term, call it the bottleneck of the mind. How many mental balls can you juggle at any one moment in time? Any guesses? Bless you. Show off. Yes. Yes. I have to. No, don't start that. Okay. The only problem is you can't juggle one ball, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Any sensible guesses as opposed to the. Sorry? Okay, we've got 3. So in the 50s, this fella called Miller wrote a paper. This is a paper worth reading. It's called The Magical Number 7. And he said, at any moment in time, we can juggle 7 plus or minus 2 balls at any one moment in time. I can see a few nods. Some of you might actually even have read it. I think the 3 answer is actually a better answer. Certainly my work on performance, particularly when I'm debriefing individuals about where things haven't gone terribly well, if you're getting up to 3 or 4, you're starting to lose aspects of that working memory. And Cowan repeated Miller's work, and he said it's not 7, it's 4. But something has happened to our working memory that's made it worse over the last 50 years. Would anyone like to give me a shout? Too much input, certainly. Stress. Any better answers? Thank you. Yes. Smartphones have made us stupid. I used to say that as a joke, but actually there's quite a lot of evidence coming through now that actually we rely too much on our smartphones and not enough on our working memory. So the working memory acts as a bottleneck between 2 things. A skill, and I don't think it matters what the skill is. Whether it's a physical skill, a cognitive skill, and I can't remember is he not the diabetic gentleman physician who was here earlier? Has he gone? Because he was talking about cognitive workload. This is about cognitive workload, really. So working memory, limited, skill, and then you've got your long-term memory. How big is your long-term memory? It is massive. Okay, so if this is a physical representation of my working memory, yours is probably bigger than this. My long-term memory is probably bigger than Europe. But the performance of that skill is dependent on what I put in that long-term memory box. And when we talk about experience, so the difference between managing ABCDE as a medical student and ABCDE as an anaesthetist, you say, oh, I'm much better because I'm experienced. But actually, it's not just the fact that you're experienced. You've got lots of stuff in your long-term memory, but you're also much more able to deal with stress, as somebody mentioned. And sadly, when we're stressed, we become a binary unit. Now, by that, I mean you either do nothing, which is your classic rabbit in the headlights response, which was me on Wednesday afternoon. I can't oxygenate this patient. I'm supposed to be an NIOAN expert. What am I going to do? Yeah? And your classic fixation error. Got to intubate, got to intubate, got to intubate. And there's a -1 response, which is where you run around with your hair on fire. Now, just looking at that picture, how many of you noticed that I changed the quotes or the references in the bottom corner of the slides? Okay, we got a few of you. But that just demonstrates to them that you were actually listening to what I was saying. Hopefully you were focusing on some of the stuff I was saying, but you weren't able to focus on some of the other aspects of the slides. Yeah? And of course, this is almost this is the other nadir of human performance. So the two nadirs of human performance, 4 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So let's have a human factors talk at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Thanks, Damien. Okay, remember I said to you about vulnerability? What colour are those balls? Different, yeah? No, they're not. Weird, isn't it? I can't unsee that even though I've looked at it 100 times. Yeah. And this is, how many of you drive with your phone on in the car? Don't lie to me. Jeepers. So this is eye tracking data taken from a driving simulator. You're driving down the road. The top mirror is your rear view mirror. These are your two side mirrors. This person got good situation awareness. They're looking all over the field. They're checking their rear view mirrors. And even though this is a dead straight road, they're covering the whole of the field of view. This is what happens when the phone rings. Just rings. You go cognitively blind. And I didn't believe this. I don't have a car anymore, but the car I used to have didn't actually connect to my phone, which is probably just as well. But my wife's car does. And I was driving my wife's car up to North Wales one day, a route I didn't know particularly well. And phone rings. What do? You answer it. 5 minutes later, I realize I'm driving in completely the wrong direction. So you may think you're going, yeah, I'm cool, I can talk on the phone, but you're not. So, as I said, 3 key issues. Error is normal, performance is variable, but we can mitigate that by information sharing. The other problem is we live in a very complex environment. I don't know, is this your normal day case anesthetic? And the other problem is, as we mentioned earlier, is that in high-pressure situations, our performance is likely to degrade. Now, the top left-hand curve is a graph of team or personal performance against pressure in the workplace. Okay? What they call the inverted U-shaped Yerkes-Dodgson curve. I don't think it looks like that. I think it looks more like this one, where you get to an improving performance and then you fall off a cliff. Yeah? And I think the other problem is certainly what happens outside that environment, particularly things like having to put up with the horrible working conditions we've had to in previous 2 years, is that we spend far too much time at the top of that curve. And the problem is then it takes only a little bit to shove us off that into a performance drive. And the other thing I've noticed over the years dealing with people who have proper burnout is when you get down to here, it's very difficult to get back onto any performance curve, which is very sad. And the reality is you never perform as well as you think you're going to perform. How many of you, when you're training, and I ask the trainees this, practice under stress when you're doing sim stuff? I've got into whole Barney arguments about this with sim people. How many of you practice like that? Because if you're not practicing under stress, you don't know how you'll perform when you're stressed. And I didn't realize, I like to think myself as pretty cool, relax under pressure, kind of perform at work anyway, not at home. I have children. But on Wednesday afternoon, when I got really stressed, I think my stress level was so way up there when I could not oxygenate this woman by all the skills that I've learnt over the last sort of 40 years as an anaesthetist. I was astonished. I thought, well, I have to do something, because otherwise bad things are going to happen. But fortunately, I have done a lot of training in that kind of environment where you gradually increase the cognitive workload on that working memory and then see how people perform. So, not that. And I know we put pressure in the workplace. I don't think you can delineate between pressure in the workplace and pressure from other environments. Noise, food, home, relationships, etc. And as I said, we spend far too much time at the top of that curve. So what are you doing on a daily basis to make sure that you're not in that danger level? So, what do you do as an individual to make a positive contribution in the environment that you work in? Anybody got any suggestions I can take back to Cardiff? So one of the things we do is we buy coffee and tea for our midwives on a random basis, so they don't know when it's coming. Yeah? Okay, so hopefully you work in an environment, and I have to say, I love coming to Ireland because they're always so welcoming here. The bars here are just tremendous fun. You could do CBT. What does CBT stand for? Cake Behavioural Therapy. Okay, so here's some team skills. So again, some work from NASA. They looked at a variety of aspects of improving performance, and they came up with these 8 criteria that you see here. I want you to read through those quickly, and I'm going to get you to vote in a minute as to which one you think is. So one of them is more important than all the others. And I will go through them quickly. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I'm way behind on where I should be, as per usual. So how many people think briefing? Nobody. Leadership? Nobody. No. Okay. Communication? Okay, we got 1 there. Interpersonal relationships? 1, 2, 3. Good. Team feedback? 1 or 2. Preparation? Okay. Inquiry? And workload? Okay, so top marks to those who said this. That is the golden one, because all the others feed off that. If you've got good interpersonal relationships, good things happen. If you've got poor interpersonal relationships, none of the rest of it works anyway. And what you can do with good interpersonal relationships, increase the size of that working memory, or make it smaller by using poor interpersonal relationships. And of course, rude surgeons impair anaesthetist performance. But I can guarantee you rude anaesthetists impair surgeons' performance. Rude anybody. We used to have a midwife who was probably one of the only people I've ever complained about in my unit, who was rude to the patients, rude to the staff, rude to everybody. It was hopeless. It was a very, very difficult person to work with. But the point was she made everybody else's performance worse. So, remember this one? I can see some of the younger trainees saying, "What's 5-pentone?" That's where they used to be kept in our cupboard. I've seen both of those drugs given the wrong way around, and 5-pentone is not a very good antibiotic. These are recent ones. This one's a fairly recent one. The levobupivacaine sodium chloride one, I think, is absolutely terrifying. Absolutely bonkers. How do you cope with something like this? I did a human factors talk to the pharmacist. That was fun. They said, when you make a mistake, read the label. So I did that find the mistake thing. They couldn't find the mistake either. And this is another thing the pharmacist did for us. So they provided us with a bottle that looks like that. Looked exactly like a paracetamol bottle. Only it was bupivacaine for the surgeons to infiltrate the joints. And they put the danger thing on the top. So what do you do with it? Thank you. So I'm going to cough, excuse me. Fortunately we managed to stop by getting to the theatre before it caused any significant harm. Bupivacaine, by the way, is really not a good drug to give intravenously for those who haven't tried it. Don't try it, that was a joke, okay? It happens in cooking as well. My son and I were watching MasterChef some years ago, and it was the professional chefs, and they had to make this, what's that called, a souffle? Looks lovely, doesn't it? What do you think happened when he tasted it? Yeah. And what was hilarious was I said to my son, let's rewind the tape. He said, don't have tapes anymore, Dad. But you can rewind it, you know what I mean. Rewound it, and there was the sugar and salt next to it. And he said, how can a professional chef make such a stupid mistake? I said, let me show you how. So aviation's the answer? No, it isn't. A plane is designed to fly. If it cannot fly, it won't take off. Human beings are not designed to be anaesthetized, and they're often not working properly when the occasion arises. I don't know about you, but certainly in Cardiff, that's the problem we have. And they don't have spares or etc. Yeah? And I love this bit. 2 Air France pilots suspended after cockpit fist fight. And safety begins with you. Yeah, I know. So we've got to have good situation awareness. This is the aforementioned cat, okay? She wasn't very impressed when I gave her the antibiotics. We lost her for a few days. Did eventually find her. And you've got to have situation awareness when you're a thing like this, and it's very difficult, isn't it? So let's talk about some solutions in the last minus 2 minutes I've got. The paper that we talk about discusses 12 particular principles that you can implement, and I'm not going to go through those because they're interesting, but they're not. It doesn't really fit in, I think, with the talk I'm trying to give today. But they're based around, the problem is that a lot of the time we say education is the answer. Education is useful, but it's probably the least effective in terms of improving human performance in this particular domain. It's the easiest to implement, whereas things like designing a system that works properly is the hardest to implement. So the 12 recommendations cover things: 3 design, 3 barrier, 2 mitigations, 2 education and training, 1 well-being and 1 strategy. As I said, I'm not going to go through them. But if you scan this picture, you can have them. I will show this again in a minute, so don't worry about it just now. But let's look at a few practical things we can do in our day-to-day work. So this is how I set up a spinal tray, and this is how I expect my trainees to set up a spinal tray, and actually my consultant colleagues. So I'm sitting here, I'm right-handed, that's me. The patient's back is over there. I divide the particular tray, I don't know how you set your trays, into a bin area and an active area. And then I set it up like this. 1, 2, 3. So local anesthetic, and my 10 ml syringe goes into the back, into the bin. Spinal needle goes into the back. The only drug that is anywhere near me is my 5 ml intrathecal drug. Okay, so that's both a physical and a cognitive bin. One of the previous speakers before lunch talked about major obstetric hemorrhage. This is the one we use in Cardiff. We've been doing this with Rotem for a very long time. One of the things I would say, I didn't get an opportunity to talk in that session, but this is the biggest change in obstetric anaesthesia in the 30 years I've been an obstetric anaesthetist, in that it has undoubtedly saved women's lives. It's certainly, I haven't done a, touch wood, haven't done a cesarean hysterectomy for at least 4 or 5 years. Whereas there was certainly in my early career as a consultant, we were doing at least 1 or 2 a year. It is an absolute game changer. And the amount of blood that we transfuse now is hugely down on what we used to do. But to remember all that stuff, I get somebody to read this out to me, because I can't remember it. My working memory is just as fragile as anybody else's, particularly in resuscitation. What about me? Anybody know what this acronym is? This is my human factors in the slide. Start on the bottom left-hand corner. Say what you see. Isn't that what they say on that program? HALT. Very good. I'd love to know where they serve these. Damien, you tracked it down yet? So that's the hungry. And these are, by the way, not recommendations. Okay, these are things to avoid. But if I've been teaching human factors for about 20 years. I'm very good at doing this for my colleagues. I'm very bad at doing it for me. And I was reminded of this about 6 months ago, and one of my trainees sat me down. I obviously wasn't performing quite as well as I thought I was. And she said, right, sit down. Very assertive, my trainees. And she gave me a coffee and a muffin. I'm thinking, yeah, I'm obviously a bit skewiffy today, so having a coffee and muffin felt much better. Sleep, the most important performance-enhancing agent we have. Okay? If you can improve and enhance your sleep by an hour a night, you can improve your performance by up to 10%. There is nothing else that even comes close. Those of you who have children, you will be completely very aware of this. Okay, and we can look at ways of managing our cognitive workload, being aware of things like areas of vulnerability, looking and learning in the environment you work in, managing stress, making sure that your team are with you, and managing your environment. So plan your days, weeks. What's a gumption drainer? Give me a gumption, great Scottish word. Go on. Yeah, that's what a gumption drainer is, absolutely. A mood hoover, exactly. Practice your drills, both physically, but also cognitively. Any of you come across, these Red Bull pilots who fly around doing these crazy stunts? Well, the guy who won a lot of the races in 2019, also his daytime job is actually I might have a picture of it here. No, I'm going to go back. The guy who won it also flies a jumbo jet. That's his daytime job. He's a BA pilot. So I don't know what you did in lockdown. I suspect you were working a bit like me. But what he decided, because he couldn't fly at all, was him and his mate would fly side by side through a barn. Okay? Yeah? It is as crazy as it sounds. But I had a long chat with him, and he basically spent a year rehearsing that in his head before he did it. How many of you, before you're about to go into a difficult environment, practice rehearsing that? I work with a renal surgeon who, when he's doing a live donor transplant or has to get the kidney out in a bit of rush, before he starts the operation, he will sit down and rehearse the thing in his head and go through each of the things that he has to do and how quickly he has to do it and what he's going to do if things don't work out. Good communications, good relationships. The thing that saved me on Wednesday was the guy I was working with, I've worked with before. He's a really good surgeon. I had a really good surgical team, and we just clicked. The team worked really well, and they took a lot of the cognitive workload off me. And when I called for help, which is hilarious, so one of my colleagues comes in to give me a hand once I got things slightly under control. And he said, the last thing on earth I wanted to hear was this call for help from the person who was supposed to be our airway expert on an airway problem. But he was a sight for sore eyes, I have to say. Anybody know what the 3 C's are? So I said, I've got a well-being interest. Yeah, no, that's the other 3 C's. So the 3 C's of Stoic philosophy are control what you can, cope with what you can't, and concentrate on what counts. And if you embed your sort of life, have that as your life philosophy, you'll do very well. I came across a 4th C, which wasn't COVID. Anybody? It's the kind of pandemic I would like to encourage. Anybody like to guess what the 4th C might be? And interesting, it's not coffee. Well, that's very important, I think. So in the same way that panic is contagious, so is calm. And the other thing that we managed to do, because I asked for feedback after my rather appalling performance on Wednesday afternoon, they said, well, the one thing you did do was keep calm. I said, you should have seen me inside. And have a stress management kit. So Fiona Kelly has her 8 things that you can do tomorrow. Use a VL. You all use a VL in your GAs now? Practice using a hyperangulated blade. I always use a hyperangulated blade, I must say, and I teach people a slightly different skill with the VLs. First names. You all know the names of people in theatre. We started writing them on the board. I think that's a really good way, because it's shame for me to confess this. I've worked with some people for many years, and I don't know their names, which I think is terrible, really. Say what you're thinking. This is not going well. The patient is severely hypoxic and I can't oxygenate them. Surely it needs to be sorted out. Practice HF tools. Closed loop communication. I've told you this. What have I told you? Tell it back to me. Practice box breathing. Do you all know what box breathing is? Yep. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. One of the things we know from performance data is that if your heart rate is above 120, it becomes very difficult to do fine motor skills. And if you do box breathing, that slows your heart rate down and it actually makes your whole physiology and psychology and function better. I know with the trainees, they practice it before they're about to do something. So when they're pre-oxygenating a patient, they'll box breathe. When you're doing a spinal and you're drawing up the drugs, box breathe, so that when you come to do it, you've got this nice slow heart rate, this nice calm outlook. So, I sometimes talk about what should I have been concentrating on that case that we started off with. Well, I need to concentrate on giving the mother oxygen, because that's why my SATs are not doing well. I need to talk about this woman needs an emergency cesarean section, so I need to make sure that I'm focusing on the anesthesia. That particular incident that I described to you, they started off the anaesthetic without any monitoring, which I suspect was because there was so much stuff going on. But you do need to know what's going on with your patient, otherwise you don't know how to manage that. And keep calm. In your long-term memory, there's a whole stack of other stuff, but that needs to be preloaded before you come, and then hopefully your airway management will be perfect. So there's the QR code. That will take you straight to the paper. Thank you very much again for inviting me. I'm looking forward to questions or anything else that you want to ask on human performance. I don't think I can cope with my colleague's CV, but I'll try and keep up. Thanks very much again.
Yeah, there's room there for you at the table. Thank you.
Right, folks. So, thank you so much. I know very much from my way of thinking with regards to human factor things, Mark, that was brilliant. But Rachel, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that come through first, if that's all right. Probably the most simplest one for you, okay? With your in-depth knowledge, how does that specifically affect your consent process when you're doing an epidural? Do you think you do it differently from the rest of people? Probably not, but is there anything that you would specifically want to be adding in than maybe what's on the Labour Pains website and things like that?
To be honest, not particularly. I tend to sort of tailor it to the women, and I'm pretty pragmatic. I think most of us probably recognise that consent's pretty difficult in the throes of labour, so I'm all about getting on with it quite quickly, to be honest. If the woman's in the throes of agony, I will be very concise and to the point and do it while I'm scrubbing to just essentially get a move on and get it done. If someone's in an early stage of labour and wants to have a big long chat about it, I'll do that. I don't tend to start chatting about autism unless they particularly want to bring it up, which to be honest isn't that common. So no, pretty standard labour pain style consent, but tailored to the situation. I'm pragmatic.
Yeah, no, that sounds very reasonable. Mark, I'll move on to yourself. Just one of the questions that sort of listening to you as you went through it, a lot of us have seen some of this before with regards to the importance of human factors, and that it generally is taught to us that you're now more aware of it, so this is how you should address your behaviour and things. But is there an onus on the trusts and the hospitals and the environment that we're working in to actually be using this for learning? So if there is an incident that happens, how does the organisation learn from it rather than necessarily the individual?
That is a superb question. I didn't address that specifically, but we do address that exact question in the paper. And when we got together as a group to decide on what we were going to do with that information, our philosophy was actually getting exactly answering that question. And I think that it's the 12th recommendation is there needs to be a strategy, and that means that needs to be driven at trust level. There's been quite a lot of traction. The paper was published in January, and there's been quite a lot of traction since in terms of Clinical Human Factors Group have endorsed the guidelines, OAA have endorsed the guidelines, and pretty much everybody, I think the veterinary sciences are looking at endorsing it, because there's practical advice in there that you as an individual can implement for yourself, that your department can implement, your CD can implement, your medical director can implement, and your chief executive can implement. And I think it's the onus is on us. They're not going to do it on our behalf. But for example, things like procurement. How many of you have to deal with poor kit? Yeah, I know. And how do we deal with that? Well, one of the things we've said is you go to procurement because it's quite interesting. One of the things I discovered when I went to procurement was they have literally no idea what we do. So it's not entirely their fault that they will order something that is completely inappropriate for what we want to use it for. But if you discuss things like that with them, you then start to get into that design thing at the bottom. The pharmacists, for the first time, I've been trying to change this for 20 years or more, are beginning to realise that actually having drugs that look alike is just dangerous. And they're finally starting to engage. But yeah, I think the onus is on us to say, look, to our CDs, we're going to start somewhere. We'll start here. Here are some guidelines that we can use in terms of actually learning from mistakes. There are much better frameworks than the ones that have been used. So I think the one that we recommend is, I think it's the Yorkshire framework. Is that what it's called? Which actually has a much more broadened approach to actually addressing why did the event occur. You show me any incident where a human being is being blamed, and I guarantee there are probably 19 or 20 other things that would have stopped that happening if the process had been designed properly. Root cause analyses are useless. The philosophy of never events is just insane. By obvious, if a never event happens, then it's obviously not a never event. So there's lots of stuff in there. I just think we need to start. As I leave the anaesthetic stage, if we can implement some of those changes, it'll make a better world. It'll make a better job for us, but also a better world for our patients.
Thank you so much. Rachel, just another question for yourself then. How important is the loading dose and volume of drug given when initialising the and initialising an epidural?
I think, to be honest, there's many ways to skin a cat. My preference is to give a fairly decent volume, so I give 20 mils of pretty dilute stuff, and I think the scoosh effect, sort of giving that volume, so it's not a high dose, but it's a bigger volume. So for me, I prefer to give more, the same dose but in a larger volume, to just kind of try and get that height. I think there's lots of reasonable ways to do it, so I don't think that's a be-all and end-all, but that seems to work for me. But yeah.
I would agree with that, and I think the other advantage that has is it tells you pretty quickly whether your epidural is working or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'd have exactly the same philosophy there.
Oh, cool. I think that's one of the things that I've changed in my practice over the last number of years, is that I've changed from that 10 mils of 0.25, I'll not say where I was taught that, but changed to the 20 mils.
I hasten to add, I don't give it all in all.
Yeah.
When I said scoosh, I didn't mean all at once. I give it incrementally, but you get the idea.
I'm definitely not down to 2. I would know. Grant. So the other question then for yourself, Mark, was with regards, you mentioned about training and doing simulation under pressure. Any suggestions on how you would do that? And a wee bit of a add-on to that is, should you be doing it in situ or remotely, with a bit of the safety of learning aspect of it?
I have hilarious discussions with some of my highly trained educationalists on this, and I did a master's in medical education in my 40s, and that was probably one of the most stressful things I've ever done, mainly because the people who were teaching me knew absolutely nothing about teaching medical education. But that's a story for another time. So I'm going to give you 2 examples which I use and seem to work really well. So the first is understanding that when you're teaching a novice, as opposed to teaching somebody who's more experienced, you actually have to take the stress off them and make things as easy as possible. You have to be very aware of that working memory bubble and the fact that it's very easy to overload it. So for example, if I was teaching a novice a spinal, I'd say to you, I just want you to concentrate on one thing on this case, which is getting the needle in the right place. I will do everything else. I'll set the tray up, draw the drugs up, manage the patient. And then you start to increase the cognitive workload. So as they get better, you say, right, you do the spinal and set up the tray and manage the patient. Once they can do it, I'll say, right, I'm going to let you crack on, and unless you're doing something stupid or dangerous, I will not interfere. And that then in its own right sometimes causes them a bit of stress. And then with the very experienced trainees, coming back to the spinal thing, I'll just say to them, I'm timing you. I used to come up with this. This patient is the medical legal lawyer, and her husband's currently. But you don't have to. You just say, I'm timing you. But I'm not really interested in how fast they do it. I just want to see what happens to their behaviour. When I teach fibre optics, it's slightly different, but you could probably apply the same principles. Certainly, I suppose I'd apply the same principles to teaching epidurals. So with fibre optics, I go, teach them a skill on a mannequin, and then I ask them to improve the speed without getting rough. And then I've got anybody seen the Simbon app? It's an app that you can manipulate. You can pretend you've got patient data on it. So I'll put that next to the head, and then we'll get them to. I'll just put the pulse oximeter on, going doot 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 doot, and then I'll say to them, "What were the sats when you intubated?" They're going, "What sats?" They're going, "Did you not see the monitor?" They go, "What monitor?" Then you show them a video. The monitor's like it's the size of a normal monitor, and then you can talk about situation awareness and being aware of. So I said, "Well, how would you manage that?" In clinical work, what I do again is once they've done that basic training on the mannequin, and they'll learn it pretty quickly actually, because the motor skill is very straightforward. First patient, I'll use the same sort of cognitive approach. I'll say, right, first, this case, I just want you to do the fibre optic. I will do everything else. On these types of patients, make sure they're safe, etc., etc. By the last case on the list, again, I just say to you, I'm timing you. And then when the performance degrades, then we can start saying, right, okay, what happened between the 3rd and 4th intubation? The 3rd intubation was lovely and smooth, took you 90 seconds. 4th intubation, you looked like you were trying to do it with a machete. The difference is, they say, well, you stressed me. I go, well, yes, but what does that mean? What I'm trying to get them to understand is you forget stuff that you thought you knew because you're stressed. So, okay, so what you need to learn now is not to learn the stuff. You need to learn how to manage yourself so that you don't get stressed in that environment. And it works. And I know it works because they'll go then and they'll work with somebody else. And they're going, it's not going to be stressful working with that guy.
No, fair enough. So, Rachel, another question's actually come through here on Slido with regards to, and yourself, Mark, you can answer this. Great talk, so well done. What epidural analgesia regimes do the speakers use in their hospitals? Is it the programmed intermittent bolus or is it continuous infusion? And do you have a PCEA option with it? And then what local anaesthetic, as in dose and fentanyl things, do you use?
So we just use, it's pretty bog standard, 0.1% levo with 2 mites per mil fentanyl, although the bags have run out. So in brilliant human factors way, we're making up the vials of fentanyl and labels, and it's an absolute shocker. But anyway, Mistake City, but I don't think we've had one yet. We're all super aware of it, but it's a bit of a recipe for disaster. But normally we just have the pre-made bags, which are, that's fine. Personally, for the loading dose, I just use 20 mils of that, and then we run the infusion. Now, we're still using continuous infusion with PCEA. It isn't that long ago that we got those pumps, probably about a decade, but it's not, it's not like we've been doing that for a million years. But I quite like to move to the programmed intermittent epidural boluses. So I was really interested in the really good presentation that was done this morning, because I think maybe that's better, and I think it would be quite useful to try. Certainly the evidence seems to be suggesting that it is, so I think maybe we need to move with that. Yes, but that's what we have at the moment. That's what our pumps do. Certainly quite old pumps, so maybe we'll get some investment.
So we've just changed to new pumps, and it's what I was going to ask one of the speaker gave that presentation this morning, because I actually can't program the pumps. I've been taught like 3 times.
They're hard.
And I have to get this is where my colleagues will be like, yeah, take the old man and we'll sort it out. But so we use the same mix as you, and I think we are starting to use PIUB with. So we set it up. So we bolus it in the way that I've described, with a bigger bolus, and then once the block is established, we leave it. It says PCEA, I think, with PIUB. But I think we can do both.
And that's really cool, and I think the benefit for us in Northern Ireland is usually once one department starts it, the rest take it on quite quickly because the trainees all rotate through.
They teach us, don't they?
Absolutely. That's it. They bring the good ways with them. And even from the guidelines this morning, you've seen how so many of them are being suggested that these are going to be regional guidelines for us and through the NIOAN committee, etc. With regards, I suppose one of the local things that when you're mentioning about the drugs, most people in the room will have noticed this. Maybe it's a year ago now, COVID always affects time, but the midazolam and the rocuronium files and how similar they were, that was the big thing that, which one's the relaxant?
I took that picture out. Yeah, scarred me.
With regards, and I suppose epidural training comes into this, do you think there is aspects with regards to training, but also the added stress environment? Should we be doing mandatory training? We do it for airway emergencies, but should we be doing it for other things? And should we have, as a specialty, a list of mandatory training that we go through each year or twice a year?
Oh man, mandatory training. I suspect. Do you guys all do your trust mandatory training? No. I mean, I think we've got to be sensible about this. I think what's interesting about the principles of teaching them the way that we teach them the spinals, you can apply to epidurals, you can apply to GAs. As you say, we do airway training, we do a GA sim because we don't do many GAs anymore. I don't know if you do that, Rachel. But,
yeah, we do. We don't do many.
But I think you need to teach people to apply those principles then to the other aspects of it. And I think, again, it's about making that human. So they talk about technical skills and non-technical skills as if they're different things. They're not. The patient's just interested in what actually happens. So I think it's important that when we're teaching the stuff, we start to sort of bring in some of the aspects of the other bits that are relevant to that. You mentioned the rocuronium midazolam. The other one, I just warn you, is the tranexamic acid. There have been some absolute disasters in other countries with tranexamic acid being injected intrathecally. And because we're using it so much now to diminish PPH, I am quite concerned that we are going to have a similar problem here. because there are lots of sort of tranexamic ampoules hanging around. And so it's a very nasty drug if you inject it intrathecally.
Well, thank you so much. Unless there's any other questions from anyone in the audience.
Go.
There's a few. Sinead.
One of the things that I recently read is called Surrounded by Narcissists. So what do you do when you have a narcissist?
Ooh.
And obviously interpersonal relationships in it.
So can you just give me an idea of what you think a narcissist is?
It's the table you're sitting at, isn't it?
And I have a question for you, sir. Go on.
So a narcissist is, in simple terms, somebody who will see themselves always as the best at everything. They're hard to argue with. They see themselves as right all the time. And it's not that they're necessarily wrong, and it's not about necessarily what they're saying. It's usually about how they're saying it.
Okay, that's really interesting. So occasionally I get called to deal with people like that. And I've used a variety of different techniques. I was asked to do some HF training with a whole department. I won't embarrass the surgical department by saying which surgical department it was, but you can probably work it out. But anyway, they came to the training, and I ran a session, bigger session than this, but a bit more interactive. I'm pretty sure it was targeted at one particular individual who was exactly as you described. He was actually a pretty good surgeon, but exactly as you described. And I then subsequently went and did a list with him, and he went from being the person that nobody wanted to work with to the person that everybody wanted to work with, because having gone through this just becoming aware of these kind of things and the interpersonal relationship stuff, and the fact that as a leader people will take feed from your lead. His list was brilliant. He'd do a briefing at the beginning, and I go, wow, I should video this and show this to the other surgeons. And then and the staff just started flooding back to that theatre, because he was a narcissist, but he was really, really good at what he did. And I don't think he realised that he'd actually changed. I think but it worked really well. I've had to have a couple of one-to-ones with individuals when their behaviour has crossed the line. And I said to them, look, if you carry on behaving like this, and it's an advantage being an old senior consultant. If you carry on behaving like this, nobody will work with you. And that seems to change the behaviour. And I said, look, and they'll say, well, how do I change my behaviour? I said, well, skills. You can start off by trying to be a little bit nicer. You can start off by understanding that sometimes, yes, you may be right, but the way that you're saying it isn't helpful. It's challenging, and then there are people that you can't change.
This is my next part. Do you think the people that change, do you think they have a true narcissist? Or do you think... That's what I just found really sad. By the end of it, I basically felt like, so it's not really the person that needs to change, it's actually everything around the person that needs to change to facilitate.
It's really tricky, isn't it? It's really tricky. So the other group that sometimes, some of my senior trainees get a little bit too big for their boots, and they start getting really narky and I get complaints from midwives and the theatre sisters. And what I've found is sitting down and say, look, you are now one of the senior members of this department. You are part of a team that is crucial to looking after our patients. Your behaviour drives the team's behaviour. And I said, if you behave in the way that you behaved this morning, because they're aware they've done something slightly wrong, because we're sitting down having a conversation. And I said, look, it's your choice. You can carry on behaving like this, but life will become unpleasant for everybody, or you can change. And most of them do. Sometimes I think sometimes the other problem is we try and avoid the situation by not actually giving them I've been given that feedback by a trainee. He said to me, you scare the hell out of people. Yeah. And I said, well, sometimes I do it deliberately. He said, yeah, but you do it all the time. Okay. And I've tried to back off. I don't know if I've succeeded. But it's helpful. But I think sometimes we don't realise how we appear to other people until somebody shows a mirror to our face. And sometimes when you do that, I think we're all majority of people who work in health they care about the patients. That is their primary drive. It's a challenging. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, but it's a challenging. But it's definitely, honestly, when you get it right, and I've got it right a few times, it's so exhilarating.
I think you're right as well, Mark. I think it's one of those things that they talk about in terms of the standards. A standard you walk past is a standard you accept, and I think that fits to relationships and behaviour as well. And I think it is easier when you're older, grey haired, to not just say to people. I think it's much more difficult for people who are more junior actually as well within the field. But I think senior people need to drive those standards and gently call people. And you know you're going to gently call them. If this is the narcissist and it's every Wednesday, you're both going to be in this very unhappy and
you work on a Wednesday as well, do you? Yeah, me too.
You know what I mean? And I think it is. I think it's important that people, senior people, that teams drive this kind of change and own up to their own vulnerability in that as well. So you're human too, and if you frame the whole thing in this is about everybody, it's not just about you.
I cannot emphasise interpersonal relations stuff enough. And human factors is about human behaviour. We're all judged by our worst behaviour, unfortunately, both by our patients and the staff we work with. But if you built up a relationship with those people, they'll look out for you. If I'm stressed, I'm just as mad and angry, I think, as any sort of stressed, mad, angry old man. But hopefully my staff remember that I'm not always like that, which means that when things do go bad and I get a bit niggy. I had an incident with very poorly resuscitated neonate that I had to step in. And I physically had to remove the person out of the way because they didn't respond to me. And then I could see from the look on, I just got on resuscitated, but I could see from the look on that person's face that they were singularly unimpressed with the way I managed it. But once I'd calmed things down, I then went and apologised. I said, look, I'm really sorry, but I said, that child needed oxygen. And I said, I didn't quite say, it was quite obvious you hadn't the faintest idea what you were doing. But I politely, I said, look, I apologise. I said, but I did have to do something, and it was okay. But if I'd let that go, if I'd not spotted it because it was a member of the neonates rather than a member of my anaesthetic department. But yeah, sometimes we get it wrong, and hopefully that if you've built up a credit, then it enables you to at least. I mean, I had a colleague who got so incensed with me. Long story, but basically I said to him, look, we have to work this out because there will be a time when I need to call you for help, and I can't not call you for help just because we don't like each other. He went, fair enough. But we've got to remember that. It's not about us; it's about our patients. I have one more question, by the way, if I'm allowed.
Yeah.
My colleague here. So, how many people? A question for the audience as well. How many people here routinely do paramedian epidurals? None. Okay. That's probably the answer to my question. Is there any difference between and I've not been able to find any useful difference between the paramedian approach and the midline approach for the functionality of epidurals?
I don't think so, not that I'm aware of. I sometimes do them by accident. Fabulous. Well done. I don't do it deliberately, but I don't think so. I think...
No, because I've not been able... But I think the problem is not enough people do paramedians.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wondered if I'd missed it in the literature as well.
Look, I know there's more questions in the room, and I know there's more questions coming through on the poll, so I'm going to suggest those people chat to you afterwards, and I'm sure you won't mind that, because we'll move on, because that's the wrap-up of this afternoon session, so I'm going to hand back over to the chair.
Well, that was all absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much to both of you. And thanks to everyone today. I've got a lovely wee job now. I've got the announcements for the trainee prizes for both the oral presentations and the poster presentations.